Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I'm on Grosvenor Square in London, looking at the statue of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR as he's often known. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about FDR and why he's so honoured. Well, he's best known for being President of the United States for 12 years. That's longer than anyone. He was elected 4 times and he died only a month into his fourth term. So Roosevelt, he was born in New York in 1882 into a very affluent family. His family had been in America since the 17th century. He was of Dutch and English descent. Roosevelt in Dutch means rose field. Anyway, because remember, New York had been New Amsterdam if you go back long enough ago. It was ruled by the Netherlands until, is it the Third Anglo-Dutch War? In which case it had been given to the English. Anyhow, so he went to an elite preparatory school. Obviously that's a secondary school. In this country, prep school is up to the age of 13. Then he went to Harvard University and he edited the Crimson magazine. He wasn't that academic. He qualified as a lawyer. He worked in New York for a while, and he joined the Democratic Party, which was unusual. Someone from his background would probably strongly favor the Republican Party, and some upper class WASPs regard him as a class traitor. Anyhow, so he married Eleanor Roosevelt, commonly known as Mamie, who was his very distant cousin from him. So her maiden name was Roosevelt as well. And it's not his first cousin, that's a misconception. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, who was president. So the two Roosevelt presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and FDR, were related, but only very, very distantly. So Teddy Roosevelt was the man who really coined the phrase teddy bear. Well, because of him, was very active, a rough rider in the Spanish-American War, believed in a vigorous life, risk-taking, a big game hunter and so on. And then after his president said it was his third political party, the Bull Moose Party, but didn't get anywhere. Coming back to FDR, he was he was governor of New York for some time in the 1920s. And this is about this time, just after the First World War, he was struck by polio, a disease which has been largely eradicated. So it's a contagious disease, and it usually affects children, though it can get you in middle age. And there he was, coming up for 40 when it afflicted him, as a muscle-wasting disease can afflict one leg or the other, or both. And we've got almost no muscle, you can scarcely walk. Your leg really is just skin and bone. And so he's largely wheelchair-bound after that time. He could walk unaided, only a few steps, usually had to be supported by a son, particularly Elliot, his son. He'd be leaning on him, you'll see him in some photos, using a walking stick, something like that. Braces on his legs, so he was wheelchair-bound most of his life after that. He was also Secretary of the Navy, a cabinet position, but he kept it secret, the fact that he suffered from this disability, because a lot of people were very prejudiced towards those who are physically disabled. Unfortunately, it's a prejudice which hasn't quite disappeared, and would somehow think that you're mentally unfit as well, which is obviously ridiculous. People were often shamed for being physically handicapped. So he was governor of New York for a while. Then he stood to be vice president on the Al Smith ticket, but he lost. So that was that. Then the Great Depression struck. Herbert Hoover was president, a Republican, and Hoover, he's seen to be uncaring, and a lot of homeless people, they called their encampments Hoovervilles, and having to sleep under a newspaper calling a Hoover blanket. Now, Hoover actually was caring. He was a very poor communicator. It was before being a good communicator was considered like a sine qua non of American politics. So I'm just shielding myself from the sun a little bit. So Hoover, in the First World War, he'd done so much for the people of Belgium to deliver food supplies to them when they were starving due to the blockade and the German occupation. But that didn't come across to people. Just people thought that Hoover was heartless. It was the bonus army in Washington, D.C., these veterans of the First World War wanting their payout early when they really needed it, not being willing to wait decades. Anyway, so come up to the 1932 presidential campaign. He was standing for them. Roosevelt with John Nance Garner, a Texan, as his running mate. So it was a balanced ticket. They won handily. Happy Days Are Here Again was his campaign tune. And unlike Hoover, he was a superb public speaker, and it came across to the average person that he cared about them. There was mass unemployment. People lost their jobs through no fault of their own. There was terrible hardship. There were many repossessions of farms and so on. People couldn't pay up their loan payments. Farmers have been suffering for a long time with the Great Dust Bowl. So he became a president, and there was, in his first 100 days, there were so many pieces of legislation passed. In his inaugural speech, he'd said, "We've nothing to fear but fear itself," and he wanted to convert retreat into advance and so on. So closing down various banks temporarily, allowing federal officials to sort out what was happening and to try and prevent them from going under. There are many small banks which are more vulnerable to collapse in those days, paying farmers to destroy food and not sell it, so the price went up. That helped the farmers, but of course you can imagine infuriated people who are going hungry. You're making food more expensive, and you're going to destroy perfectly good food when people are starving. It seemed grossly immoral. But anyway, there were these alphabet agencies, all these things, set up to provide work, the Works Progress Administration and so on, setting up the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And there's so many things that were built, so many federal projects, renovations of roads, building new roads, bridges, airports, things like that, beefing up the US military just to provide work to get things going. And it was panned by some as extremely wasteful, but it did get the economy going, and the recovery began. Even by the time of Pearl Harbor, it hadn't completed, but they had made some progress. So this was called the New Deal. And his vice president felt left out. John Nance Garner said being vice president isn't worth a bucket of warm piss, often bowdlerized into isn't worth a bucket of warm spit. Later he was replaced by, oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember who's next one. Because Truman, he had actually 3 vice presidents. Truman was his last. I've forgotten the second one, forgive me. Anyhow, so what else about Roosevelt? He tried to ease off the New Deal in the mid-30s, but it didn't work, and unemployment started going up again, so he had to return to it. Now, often the federal government was doing things via businesses, giving contracts to private businesses. So some socialists felt it didn't go far enough. The Communist Party wasn't tiny in those days. Some Republicans said, oh no, we should have a completely laissez-faire attitude. Well, Roosevelt said, we tried that and it didn't work. Hoover kept saying that the recovery is just around the corner, and it kept getting worse and worse. So it proved that this primitive capitalism was a bad thing, and bringing in the beginnings of a welfare state. Anyway, so he didn't like what he saw happening in the Third Reich or in Japan, but American public opinion was very much in favor of neutrality. There was the America First Committee campaigning for this. He had his critics. Remember Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, had been a supporter and eventually turned against him. There was Huey Long, Kingfish down in Louisiana, who started denouncing him as well, till he got assassinated. Anyway, so the neutrality acts were passed by Congress, saying that the United States must strive to be neutral. They didn't have any allies, but the US did have soldiers and Marines in places like Nicaragua intervening there to prop up the dictatorship, or obviously had the control of the Canal Zone in Panama. The United States repeatedly intervened in various Caribbean islands, viewing the Caribbean as little more than an American lake. Anyway, so the Second World War began, and Roosevelt was highly sympathetic to the United Kingdom, which was vital to the UK, which is why he's so honoured with his statue. And he persuaded the Congress to allow various derogations from the Neutrality Act, saying if the opinion of the President, the security of another country is necessary for America's national security, then the President can authorise weapons sales to them. So the US is still selling weapons to the United Kingdom, though it was a belligerent in the war. Remembering, of course, that the United States had sold weapons to both sides in the First World War, and many Americans felt that it eventually dragged America into the First World War when it otherwise could have remained aloof. So there was the Lend-Lease agreement, as in lending 50 old destroyers to the Royal Navy in return for various bases leased in the United States for 99 years, and so on, and a lot of financial support for the United Kingdom. And then eventually Pearl Harbor came. We all know about that. So things were changed, and that's when the Japanese Empire launched this unprovoked attack without any declaration of war on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And then Roosevelt gave a speech to Congress saying that, calling this the 7th of December, a day that shall live in infamy. And then he said that he had every confidence that America would win an absolute victory. And of course, it was cheered to the rafters, and Congress voted for war with only one lone dissenting voice. So that was the most overwhelming majority for that. I mean, the thing is, the United States was at war anyway, even though they didn't want to be. The Japanese weren't going to stop attacking. They'd attacked, then they attacked American possessions in various other places like the Philippines, British colonies like Malaya, that's now Malaysia. So I won't tell you the whole story of the Second World War, but he visited the United Kingdom. Well, sorry, he had Churchill visit him. He eventually went to Yalta, met Stalin and Churchill. Now, he didn't get along as well as Churchill as you're led to believe. However, it was necessary for the Allied soldiers and sailors and so on to believe that the leaders were bosom buddies. But he was a wily politician. He thought that he could handle people. And as he wrote to Stalin, the United Kingdom will be financially through after the war for a long time. Well, it was definitely on the money, if you forgive the pun. The United Kingdom was going to be broke after the Second World War, having spent a quarter of its wealth. So it would be very much diminished in stature. And the world would be for the Soviet Union and the United States to dominate. And he did suggest meeting Stalin separately, either Alaska or Siberia, as in that they could meet and not have to invite Churchill because it's quite far away. But if you see him at the Yalta conference in January 1945, that's the Crimean Peninsula, he's looking very drawn and haggard. He was a dying man. He'd also met Stalin and Churchill at the Tehran conference sometime beforehand. Though he was bonhomous and he knew how to butter people up, Roosevelt, he wasn't as enthusiastic about Churchill as the public were led to believe. Anyway, he died at Warm Springs, Georgia, in April 1945, and Hitler heard the news on the radio. So it's the 12th of April, and he said, "My goodness, maybe this is an omen from Providence. At the last possible moment, there'll be a total reversal of fortunes, and the Third Reich will win." Well, obviously, it was far too late for that. So his Vice President Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, became president. There was after that no vice president. In those days, there's no mechanism whereby a vacancy for the vice presidency could be filled mid-term. Roosevelt fallen out with his previous vice president, and so that's why he'd chosen this guy. So elected 4 times, re-elected very handsomely, certainly in 1936. He won 46 of the 48 states. Only Vermont and one other didn't vote for him. I remember only 48 states back then. Hawaii and Alaska did not become states until 1959. So that's him. His body was transported by train to its funeral, and hundreds of thousands of people lined the route, like Lincoln's funeral route beforehand, to see the presidential train go by. That's the days when there were many trains in the United States. I'm not sure where he's interred. I think the Arlington National Cemetery. But anyway, he had several sons, and none of them went into politics and became particularly prominent. So there he is wearing his cape. So even though he was always in a wheelchair, the public never picked up on this. The press, for some reason, were very deferential on that issue and never told people. But you'd see, how come he's speaking from a seated position? Anyone else gives a public speech standing. How come he's sitting down when everyone else is standing up? There's famous footage of him on a warship off the coast of Canada, meeting Churchill in August 1941. And they're singing a hymn for a service, a church service on shipboard. At the front, Roosevelt and Churchill are seated. Everyone else is standing up to sing. Anyway, there we are. So Roosevelt, a very significant figure. In Eisenhower's time, the Constitution was amended and presidential terms were limited to 2 each. That's why he's the only one to have served 4. Okay, that's enough about FDR.